Have you ever picked up a t-shirt, looked at that made in tag, and just wondered? I mean, really wondered what it took to make it. We see words like eco-friendly and sustainable thrown around all the time, but what do they actually mean? Well, today we're diving into a tool that's trying to answer that. Think of it like a nutritional label, but for a factory.
Right? It's a huge question because for most of us, sustainability is this kind of fuzzy, abstract idea. We might picture solar panels or something, but when you get down to the nitty-gritty of a massive factory, it's all about the hard data. It's about water usage, energy consumption, the chemicals they use, the waste they produce. It's about making all that invisible stuff visible.
And that really gets to the heart of the problem. Without a shared, standardized way to measure and talk about environmental performance, words like green or conscious can mean pretty much anything or, honestly, nothing at all. This makes it almost impossible for us as consumers, and maybe even more importantly for investors, to figure out who's for real and who's just, greenwashing. And that's where this group comes in, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, or SASB for short. They're now part of a bigger global organization, and their whole job is to create that common language. Basically, think of them as the accountants for sustainability. They're setting the rules so that everyone is counting and reporting their environmental and social impacts the exact same way. So, where is a standard like this desperately needed? Well, let's zoom in on an industry with a truly massive global footprint: the world of apparel, accessories, and footwear. I mean, the journey a single pair of jeans takes before it gets to you is just incredible. It crisscrosses continents and involves a whole web of different companies.
And here's the thing that might surprise you. Those big brands we all know, the ones with the glossy ads and fancy headquarters, for the most part, they don't actually own the factories that make their clothes. So the biggest environmental hits, from dyeing fabrics with tons of water to tanning leather, it's all happening in facilities they don't directly control, often halfway around the world. So if the brands don't own the factories, how on earth can they keep track of the environmental impact? Well, it all starts with understanding how the supply chain is put together. It's usually broken down into what they call tiers.
Okay, so Tier 1 suppliers. These are the factories that a brand has a direct relationship with. They're the ones doing the final assembly, the cutting of the fabric, the sewing of the pieces, to create that finished product that you go and buy in a store. Pretty straightforward. But wait, where do those Tier 1 factories get their fabric and their zippers and their dyes? That's when you go deeper, to the suppliers beyond Tier 1. We're talking about the fabric mills, the dye houses, the tanneries. And let me tell you, this is where so many of the most resource-heavy processes happen. Historically, it's been a huge blind spot for everyone.
So how do you fix that? How do you manage something you can't even see? Well, you create a standard, one that forces companies to look deeper into that supply chain and start collecting some very specific data. And boom, here it is. This is straight from the SASB standard for the apparel industry. Don't worry about the code CG-A-430A.2. What it's saying is powerful. It asks companies to report the percentage of their supplier factories, both Tier 1 and deeper, that have completed a very specific assessment. And look, it even names one, the Higg Facility Environmental Module. The Higg FEM. This is the tool. This is that common language we were talking about, designed specifically for this problem. It's a standardized test, really, that a factory anywhere in the world can use to measure its own environmental performance in a consistent way. Yep, a report card is the perfect way to think about it. So now, instead of a brand just vaguely saying, "Oh, our suppliers are eco-friendly," they can say, 80% of our suppliers have filled out this specific, detailed environmental report card. See the difference? It takes a fluffy claim and turns it into a hard, verifiable piece of data. There's that old saying in business, right? What gets measured gets managed. It's totally true. So what exactly is on this factory report card? What are they measuring? The standard is super clear about this. Any assessment that wants to be considered equivalent has to track these 7 key areas. It's the whole shebang. We're talking about the big picture, like does the factory even have an environmental management system, all the way down to specifics on energy, water, waste, air emissions, and how they handle their chemicals. It's a full 360-degree view. And if you were to visualize it, the biggest environmental culprits in clothing manufacturing often boil down to these big 3. Dyeing and finishing fabrics, that uses an absolutely incredible amount of water. Powering all that machinery creates greenhouse gases. And managing chemicals and what goes into the wastewater, that's critical for the health of local ecosystems.
And look, each of these data points tells a really important story. Tracking energy tells you about the factory's carbon footprint. Measuring water is just common sense in an industry that's so thirsty. Monitoring wastewater helps make sure you're not dumping toxic stuff into local rivers. And tracking waste, that shows you where you can be more efficient and maybe even recycle more. It all connects.
Okay, so let's zoom back out. What's the real impact of having all this data? Why does this actually matter in the real world?
I mean, just look at the contrast here. On the one hand, without standards, you're stuck in this murky world of vague promises, a high risk of greenwashing, and no real way to compare what one brand is doing versus another. But with a standard like the Higg FEM, everything changes. Suddenly, you have data you can check. You create real accountability deep in the supply chain, and you finally give brands the power to make smart decisions based on actual performance, not just marketing. And that's really the end game here. This isn't about shaming factories. It's about driving improvement. Once a brand can clearly see which of its suppliers are using way too much water or energy, it can actually go in and help them get better. And, just as importantly, it can reward the factories that are already doing a great job with more business. It turns the whole supply chain from a risk into an opportunity.
Which brings us to the big final question. The tools are here, the standards exist. We finally have a clear, common language for a massive global industry to talk about its environmental impact. So the question isn't really, can we measure it anymore? The real question is, now that they can measure it, will the fashion industry truly use that data to manage it? That's the challenge and the opportunity that lies ahead.